Hey everyone, I'm Dan, the founder of JazzComposersPresent.com, an online space where composers, musicians, and listeners come together to celebrate the music we love. Our September events were incredible. We presented composer spotlights featuring Rufus, Reid, Scott Ninmer, and Chelsea McBride, our September Roundtable panel, and listening sessions with Jim McNeely, Dave Young, and Florian Hoefner. The presenting artists gave incredible insight into their compositional process, orchestration techniques, programmatic storytelling, and other great topics. The live Q&As with the community were equally engaging. October's events are off to a great start, and the rest of the month will be fantastic. Visit our website to see our entire upcoming events calendar. All our live streams stay in the past event archive for 60 days. Become a Premier Tier member today to access the archive and participate in our upcoming live streamed events. This highlights video will provide a taste of what our full-length events have to offer. Thank you for supporting JazzComposersPresent.com.
I do a lot of small group playing throughout my career, and of course big band as well. But by and large, I didn't really get to really understand how you can manipulate your creations and beyond how you initially create them. And this is pretty much how I wanted to just discuss how to get maybe some more mileage out of your compositions. This particular workshop was about trying to find something at the kernel, the birth of something. And I mean, Bob Brookmeyer, for instance, thinks about cells, 2-note cells, 3-note cells, and then you expand and it expands. And then before you know it, you have this full-blown thing. So but it took me that long because the first thing that I was told, he said, well, just write what you want to write. And I didn't know what I wanted to write because most of us write for television, circus music, bar mitzvahs, dances, television, movies, but none of that. They said, just write for what you want to write. And I had no clue what really pleased me or whatever that was. And so it took me that long to kind of gather something, but I have played with some of the greatest composers of our time. Benny Golson, Bob Brookmeyer, Thad Jones, Jimmy Heath, Lalo Schifrin. I mean, just to name a few people. And so I have a lot of stuff in my head, and I didn't really know how to get it out. On the album, The Quiet Pride, the Elizabeth Catlett project, there were actually 5 pieces based on 5 of her sculptures. And this one that we're going to hear now is called Mother and Child. And a lot of people ask me about how do I, come up with themes for the sculptures. And, I'd be lying if you're waiting for that divine lightning bolt to hit you. But, the particular sculpture, Mother and Child, was a mahogany, very abstract, but you knew it was a mother holding a baby. And there is no other, and it was smooth. There was no jagged edges or anything. And, the mother and child, there's a bond that doesn't exist anywhere else. So there's a warm sounding and smooth and lyrical. So I tried to write something that was pretty. With that, with the Mother and Child, the entire big band chart was only done with woodwinds, which is one of my challenges of really trying to work with only woodwinds and still get it to sound. I love bass clarinet and the clarinets and the flutes, and when you combine them and you do it in such a way in the voicings, it can create a sound like no other. I do remember I showed Manny Album. He was one of the coaches at the BMI, one of the founders actually, and I took a lesson with him, which was a big deal for me because I was always taking bass lessons, But this guy was amazing, and I had written out this flute thing. He said, "Well, this is pretty good, and when you have professionals, they'll be able to play it pretty good." He says, "But you don't have the guys sitting next to each other playing half steps and rubbing like that. Spread it around a little bit more, and it'll be played better," because he was looking for the money notes. The money notes are when it sounds good right away, and that's what he did, commercials, because he didn't have time to figure things out. He knew what worked and what didn't work, and so he was just telling me, he says, it's not wrong or anything, but be careful. And so I think about that when I was trying to write for this 2D section with Mother and Child to kind of keep the same vibe with the big band, but take the rhythm section completely out, and it was only a little triangle. Let's listen to that one.
Can you talk about your experience playing in the Mel Lewis Jazz Orchestra and with Bob Brookmeyer, and how they may have influenced your writing?
How about all of it? Playing with the Thad Jones and Mel Lewis Orchestra, because I played with the band probably the last 2 years with Thad, and which was unbelievable. We would play, we would travel, we would play the music, everybody would be tired, hungry, get to the bandstand, really don't want to play that first chart, everything's all right, everything is great. And playing with the band after Thad left and coming back and getting an opportunity to play with Mel and the orchestra, with Bob Brookmeyer, with his writing, which became more, a lot more. It was pretty fantastic. And yes, I think you cannot not be influenced to some degree. But Bob busted me one time because I wrote this one thing, and Jim says, "You let Bob listen to it." I said, "Oh man, I don't want Bob to listen to it." And Bob listened to it, and then he looked at it and he says, "Why did you do that?" I said, "Well, that's a trombone thing, kind of like, Thad's." He says, "I know that's a kind of like that, but why did you do that? Don't do that. Find another way." And I'll never forget that. And the one thing that I really learned from Bob that has really influenced me was he told me again, he says, "This is great, but what happened?" He says, "I was playing with a big, beautiful rainbow ball, and you took it away, but you didn't give me anything back to play with." It was the transitions, and that was a huge lesson. That was priceless. And to me, transitions still are a challenge to me, but transitions, how can you, before you go somewhere else, all of a sudden you're there and everybody didn't even know that you took them there without any hurting anybody, you know. And to me, that's a skill, and I'm still working on that one.
The impetus for writing this piece was coming from the fact that I wanted to try to write a piece that had an extra musical program attached to it. So going back to my middle school and high school days, I was very much a fan of Lord of the Rings and that series of books. And around the same time, the movies were also coming out. So that was a big thing in my life at the time. So in trying to come up with a plot that I could utilize for this piece, I thought I could try to utilize the plot of Lord of the Rings, and not to spoil that plot or get too in the weeds, but just to tell you a little bit about it for those who are unfamiliar. So we have a point of reference here. It's basically, there's this small, insignificant person who's tasked with making this improbable journey across the entire continent in order to destroy this one ring by throwing it in a volcano. And this ring was crafted by this supreme malevolent being who's using it to try to take over the world. So it's very much a David versus Goliath type of story. So in writing this piece, I was trying to convey both the journey that he undertakes from his hometown all the way into this hellish type of volcano-laden area, and then also his internal struggle between light and dark as the bearer of this ring that's constantly trying to corrupt him. So that's kind of what I was trying to convey throughout the whole piece. So within this A section, we can subdivide it a little further. So this is more or less a binary form with a coda. So this first page would be the A section. The second page is the B section on this reduction I have, and then the coda is on the third page. And each of these sections is repeated. So anytime that I have a repeated section, I usually like to try to change it subtly on the second go around. So for instance, in looking at this first page, we can see that it starts with a simple 2-voice counterpoint. But then for the repeat, I wanted to add in a third voice and make it into three-part counterpoint here. So I added in an extra bar to what would have been an 8-bar structure to create a 9th bar there. And that introduces that third voice in bar 9 there, and then we jump into it with 3 voices. If we look at the next page, here more or less I did some harmonic shifting between the first 2 systems there and the second 2, and I'll go into more detail about that in a second. There's also some rhythmic differences I did, and then in the coda on the next page, there's several different elements. So there's ornamentation of the melody. There's some density changes in terms of the voicings, harmonic changes, as well as some rhythmic adjustments. So those are all some things I'm trying to do if I'm repeating themes. But I do really like to usually state a theme at least a couple of times in order to get it into the listener's ear. So here, the melody has now transposed up a perfect fifth. And I take that same major triad over bass note thing. It's now transposed up a perfect fifth. But instead of just a bass note on the bottom, now I've turned that into a major triad. So that's going to add extra notes into the equation, which is going to provide some extra dissonance in playing off each triad off of each other. The melody note is also doubled down an octave. So yeah, we're getting quite dissonant there. But that's nothing compared to where we're going very shortly. At 137 now we have, this is just the 8 brass, we have a major 7th chord set over a minor triad. So I don't really remember how I chose these, but basically there's 7 different notes or unique notes present in this voicing, and then the melody note is doubled down the octave by one of the trombones. So this is 8 notes only in a span of an octave and a half. So it's quite a dissonant sound here. And then that gets ramped up even further when we get to 142. So now all 12 chromatic notes are present, and that's only in the span of an octave and a major 6. So only an additional, we've crammed another several notes in with only adding in an extra step to the equation. So this is a very dense sound. Trumpets are on top. They're playing in major 7th chords. So for instance, F major 7 for that first chord. Saxes are on the middle staff. They're playing a G major 7th chord on that first one, and then trombones on the bottom playing that sort of nebulous A flat sus 2 and 4 type of chord there. So within each, obviously the amassed conglomerate there is going to sound very dissonant, but within each section they actually have a relatively consonant sound. So for instance, if they were practicing this in sectional or able to at least listen across the section, when they're playing this, they might be able to get slightly better intonation than they would if the notes were a little more randomly selected. At least that was my thought in writing it in that manner.
We're going to dive right in. Now that I'm full screen, I can see all of the feelings on my face. We're going to be talking a lot about feelings today, and we're also going to be talking a lot about how you can translate those into music. So I've done a couple mini lessons for the channel. I've done a couple listening sessions. I think if you've stuck around for this whole time, you're getting a sense of what I'm into. I draw from a lot of different influences, and I take inspiration from just about anything I can find. So the pieces that we're going to talk about today, Fly By Night and Niagara, were not thought of as like in a linear fashion or like sequentially at all. I was working on bits and pieces of both of them throughout the week. And so you can hear some of those ideas back and forth in the two pieces. You're going to hear almost all of both pieces today. One of the things that I'm kind of sad about is you don't get to hear like the very, very intro, how it all starts. But we're going to start with the very opening motif so you can hear a little bit of the verse and how this sort of A section coalesces. So I was thinking, okay, hypomania is like an elevated state of consciousness, but not like the fun kind, more like the high energy kind. So for me, that feels like high anxiety, prone to anger, very impulsive behavior, but also feeling like invincible or kind of like a superhero, like I could do a million things at once. It is my most productive state. And so I was trying to think of something musically that would take those ideas and make them make sense. And that's where the key centers of these two pieces come from. So in Fly By Night, we're going to be talking a lot about the augmented scale. There's all this space in between the notes, and it's all framed around major thirds. And that's like it's a wide interval. It's not like the widest interval, but it's a wide interval. And I took a lot of thoughts from the augmented scale and was using those devices to sort of seat the tune. So it has this sort of expansive, larger than life kind of invincible feeling. When we get into Niagara, I'll talk about it a little more, but very like Dorian minor kind of things going on. So right away, there's a way of differentiating these two pieces. It's more augmented, it's more angular. And then when we get into Niagara, it's going to be a little bit more chilled out, a little more tonal consonant stuff you've heard before. So we have the image of Niagara Falls frozen, and you're under the waterfall. You're not looking at it from, the boardwalk. You're under the waterfall. You are under the weight of this huge thing. And so we're going to be very literal about that. Alex is going to be under the ensemble, and frozen above precariously, depending on the weather, are the woodwinds setting up this texture. You're going to hear other entries. Electric guitar comes in, bass comes in. There's a little bit of drum stuff, I think, setting up the verse. So there are other colors that sort of introduce themselves, but that first moment of just like nothingness, tranquility, but also apathy and kind of nothingness is what we're trying to set up here. And you'll notice it starts with just about everybody. Well, it's a big band, so like not everybody, but a lot of people dropping out. And so we're just going to have that moment of freezing on that image of you under the waterfall. Let's hear it. Line going through that. There's an ostinato. There's something constant that's like setting up that sort of higher bit. And so you notice it's piano with a rotating cast of woodwinds depending on the part, and people get added in. And that is one of the cool things about if you want a line to continue, we're going to hear more of this in the next example. give it to someone who doesn't have to breathe, and then put all the people who have to breathe on different parts of it. You get the texture shifting through the ensemble. You get people listening across the band to see who's with who, and building that sort of, I call it a hive mind in my band, but the sort of internal relationships is really important, because as soon as you get everybody connected to sort of the wider picture of music making, you have them on the same page for whatever your vision is. And it doesn't matter if you're dealing with 2 people, or if you're dealing with 19, or if you're dealing with an orchestra of like 70. Like, this is the same idea all the time. You have to get everybody into the same mindset. And so when that texture gets set up, we actually rehearsed it for a little while with just the piano and Alex, so we could hear how all the woodwind parts fit over it. And then for the rhythm section, who's sort of sneaking in through, they're finding their moments, like, and it's odd places too. Like David Riddell on guitar comes in sort of at the halfway point of the chorus, but Stephen Falk on bass is coming in on like bar 5 or 6 or something, somewhere in the middle. And it's because that's the moment where we start to, like, instead of floating, like, now we have a foot on the ground kind of thing, or we've touched the bottom maybe. And so that feeling of foundation has to be established. And there's still this sort of shiny, I always think of it as shiny. For me, this whole thing is like, you're frozen under a block of ice. Like, it's shiny, it's glassy, it's bright. And of course, that's going to make me think of high woodwinds and putting it higher in the registers and having Alex just sort of stay underneath all of that.
Hey everybody, I brought in a piece from my forthcoming album. It's not going to be out till November, but sneak peek. So it's a piece called The Melancholy Architecture of Storms, and it features Julia Easterlin on vocals and myself on saxophone. And the piece kind of develops like a brooding storm that kind of breaks. And it's this kind of metaphor for love. And I wrote it alongside a poet that I met at a residency named Sarah Perkle. And we had just met at this residency. We're both identical twins, and we both just hit it off and started writing some songs. So I arranged it for my jazz orchestra, and I hope you enjoy it.
Something really important to consider when you're writing for a vocalist with a big band is like the timbre of their voice and how they're going to fit into the ensemble. And I think the woodwinds sort of backing her up gives her this ethereal quality, like wispy clouds coming by. It's just so cool. Like, that's such a brilliant way to highlight her voice and what she does. And for me listening, it's like it almost doesn't matter what she's saying, because she becomes part of this texture, and then you get the words sort of worming their way into your brain. And I just think that's something to, I don't think we talk about it enough, is how to show off our vocalists in a way that really makes sense for them. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, that was a fun part of the process for me, just like working with words in addition to music too. And like the first verse, you don't hear it, but it starts with wind ensemble, like the wind, noises in the band. And the first lyrics are, August wind beneath the eaves reminds me of your breath in my ear. And then you've got this breath stuff happening, So it was really fun to play with that.
Yeah, I love all the variety of the woodwind textures going on behind the vocals, right? It's not a repetitive figure. Like, there's so much new things coming in towards the end, the flutes with that staccato articulation. I love that brief, like that trombone, that slide up. Is that one of those, I think in Minnesota, you have the sidechain effect on the trombones. Does it come from that? Yeah, I love that. Even it just happens once, but I also like that it's not repeated. You get this effect once, and then you want to listen to it again to get this effect again, and it doesn't get old that way. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it was. I had to find ways to change up the texture, since the melody of the verses is the same every time. So it was a fun adventure.
Yeah.
Trying to find the intimacy in the piece, but then also like the raw, like power. And I love the juxtaposition of those things, and it really reflects what the song's about too. So, yeah, thanks.
I'm curious if you usually write from that sort of program where you're trying to evoke this sense of an impending storm, or is that a new thing for you, or do you like writing from that sort of place?
Oh, like a programmatic kind of thing. Every composition is different. I mean, I don't like feeling boxed in, but like sometimes it's nice to have something like that. And this piece was originally composed as a lead sheet. And, you know, in terms of the subject matter, you know, like, I guess the poet and I kind of came up with it at the same time. It helped that we were like in the middle of like a windy storm in Connecticut when it happened. So, you know, she was able to take in all this imagery, and I was just kind of able to like brood in a room with my piano. It was really fun. But as when it came to orchestration and development, you know, it was kind of like my task was set for me. And I did like that. I think I grew as a composer. You know, it gets you out of your box sometimes, having a programmatic, you know, thing leading the way for you. So.
Well, you know, it's a great idea that you're doing this, because one of the main ways that I learned about music, especially jazz, was, you know, started in high school. My best friend was a trombone player, and we'd buy records and get together and listen to records. And, hey, check this out if you heard this. And then the same thing in college at the University of Illinois. Several of us would get together at somebody's house, and, you know, somebody, hey, check this out, have you heard this? And so it's a great way to learn, just this informal kind of listening, and you get exposed to things that you yourself may not be aware of and may not pursue. So it's a very important adjunct to the whole learning process. So there's no overriding thing to all four of these pieces. One thing that is kind of interesting is three of them really are arrangements of things. Especially the second and third one are, I think, kind of remarkable rearranging of songs. But there's no, other than that, there's no other overarching principle, except that I love all four of these things.
Nice.
And it's still humbling whenever I think I've got something going. I listen to one of these pieces and I say, okay, Jim, you're not there yet.
You mentioned creating a new atmosphere for a piece of music through the arrangement. How do you approach deciding on and creating the atmosphere for your version of the piece?
There's a couple of ways. One is just sitting back in a chair and trying to imagine the material of the song in a whole different way. You know, like I've said many times to my students, sometimes, you know, the image of the arranger or composer is somebody sitting at the piano feverishly writing, oh yeah, this, and boom, playing a chord, oh yeah. Sometimes, for me, the act of composing or arranging means doing this for a long time, and just trying to get the sound of the song in my head in a whole different kind of way. Maybe it's changing the tempo, maybe it's you know, if I think a song has a particularly aggressive nature, maybe try to re-envision it in a more tranquil nature. If it's something that is very rich harmonically, trying to reimagine it very simply harmonically simple, I guess would be the phrase. And also, you know, deciding on certain aspects of instrumentation, especially with the Frankfurt band. There are a lot of woodwind doubles you can use. You can go down the complete clarinet choir from E flat down to B flat contrabass. You can go with the flutes from piccolo all the way down to bass flute. So you've got a lot of different color combinations there. And so sometimes I'll just think of it's literally sometimes a color, you know, light green or something. It's going to be maybe a not so aggressive feeling. Sometimes I don't think of myself as, I forget the word for, what's the word for people who see colors when they hear music? Synesthesia. Yeah, right. I'm not that, but there are times I'll think of different colors or textures, you know, like suede or moss, or so, you know, it's the physical texture. And what does that sound like, and what does that feel like? So Yeah, and these are things I decide really at the very beginning. And then there's more of a detailed way I'll do it, and that is if I'm taking an existing song and redoing it, I'll just play it at the piano a lot. And, I still love playing the piano, so I'll just sit there and play it and make notes to myself about things that I might do. And sometimes it's very simple, seemingly inconsequential things that come out that I write down, and later that becomes part of the arrangement, that's really different from the original song.
Well, overall concepts, I like things to be semi-arranged, no matter how big the group is. In other words, I don't like to just go out there and create from off the top of my head. So I'm a mainstream player, and some kind of an organization always helps me to feel comfortable when I go out and play. So, but beyond that, I mean, I don't demand or hope to have everything super arranged. I like the freedom of the solo section.
As a composer, what suggestions would you give to someone wanting to write the bass using the bow in a jazz ensemble? And I'll tack on to that Dave is well known for his ability with the bow and taking bowed solos on gigs as well. So this is a really great question for Dave.
Yeah, this is a good question. I first of all would make sure, if you're writing some kind of arco line or interlude for the bass, the string bass, you want to make sure that the bass player is able to do it. You would have to ask him, how's your arco playing? Are you comfortable playing things in that style? And then you want to listen to a few bass players like George Mraz, Paul Chambers. I think even Jimmy Blanton might have recorded some arco stuff. Certainly, anyway, there's a current bass player who's very, very well equipped for arco playing, and his name is drawing a blank on me right now. But for people who can do it, you can write anything. But for people who can't, then it puts them in a bad position, and so you really have to consult with your bass player to start with. But I like the idea of writing arco parts in a jazz ensemble. I think it's a different color. It creates a different feel, and the unison between arco bass and saxophone particularly really works, or bass clarinet. It really has a special sound. So I would definitely investigate that.
There's no real thread. Again, I try to bring in a couple of things from outside the core jazz repertoire, and also from smaller ensembles. I think there's a lot to learn for large ensemble writing by studying smaller ensembles things too, because there's a lot of good ideas in there that you can then transfer to a large ensemble setting. So I brought 2 big bands, a chamber ensemble, and a trio.
With the 8th Blackbird example, how would you approach transferring those non-groove ideas to a more traditional jazz context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing to take from that is that rhythmic stuff doesn't always have to be groove based and logging in, right? So if we're searching for a more kind of a more ethereal approach or ethereal sound, using rhythms that are not all part of the same subdivisions give us that effect, and Pulse takes that to an extreme. And I would just experiment with that concept, not being shy to give sections or instruments rhythms that are completely unrelated and that don't really line up until a large number of beats has passed. Of course, you have to think about what to do with the drummer in this case. Probably I would use drums also more linear, giving them one of those different pulse, different note groupings, and just have them stick with one single rhythm, kind of making them part of an equal member of the ensemble without having to bring everything together in one groove.
The examples today and at your masterclass featured tons of complex rhythms. How would you suggest a composer or player start to get more comfortable working with those types of ideas?
That's a great question, Mark. Thank you. I think for a composer to be able to use these rhythms, you have to be able to perform them first, understand them, and perform them so that they leave the realm of a theoretical idea and become a sonic idea that you can imagine. You have to be, you have to have a sound image of what the rhythm is going to sound like that you're writing. So I would recommend checking out some recordings with complex rhythms, trying to figure out what's going on. That whole Miguel Sinon album has a lot of that in it. Start with Identities Are Changeable and listen along and try to figure out where do the meters switch. I have to admit, I still haven't figured out 100% what's happening in the piano solo. It's still the 35 cycle, but I wouldn't be able to tell you how that's subdivided. If anyone knows that, please let me know. I haven't figured that one out yet.